So if history is shaped by memory, myth, and interpretation, can we ever really know what happened in the past with absolute certainty? Probably not. As we saw in the first couple of points, recreating the past is murky at best. It's a mirage. It's really difficult to do with a lot of veracity or accuracy and probability at the same time. Unless we had some magic ability to disappear through the stones at Craig Nadoon and Outlanders with fully charged phones and in a way to actually charge the phones once they ran out to film history, we're never going to know with 100% accuracy what happened. Even then, again, as I gave you the example, 500 people reporting on the same incident still would report 500 different variations of that incident. So history is really, really murky. There's nothing else that you get from this video. Maybe it's that. Let's look at a couple other reasons just to add to the murky pool of history as to why it's really difficult to get at the past with any clarity. Number one, historical records are reflecting a certain bias and perspective of the people telling that historical record in the past. Two, those creators of the past generally were the men who ruled or conquered or were victorious in battle, and they had the privilege of telling the past how they wanted to tell the past. Now, sometimes you will see, that they lost battles and they tell about that in their annals or whatever they're called. But in general, that's still talking about a very masculine world in which the dominator concept that we talked about in video 1 and 2 is ruling the interpretation of those events of the past. They've left out all of the common folks, which is number 3. We have detailed records of kings and queens and the conquerors, but we have really very few stories of the common folks, of the majority of the people that have lived on this planet. We don't know what their daily lives were like. We don't know if they had big accomplishments. Unless you have done something major to contribute to civilization, you have not gotten written into the history books. And even then, if you weren't a conqueror, a king, a male in a privileged position or class, you probably maybe had your invention or your accomplishment adapted to one of those other people and your name got wiped out throughout of history. We can't even for sure know that that wasn't happening. I know in my own marriage, because I was in a submissive, marriage of the church, it was very common for women to do the work and men to take the credit for it. So we can't put that over not happening in the past. And number 4, I'm going to spend some more time here really unpacking this one, is the authorship and the ability to transcribe by hand with 100% accuracy from generation to generation these documents that we have built our history on are not 100% accurate, as you might already know. There's a lot of contextual irregularities and variability from one copy to the next. Now, this is my own little interpretation here, is that this is where, in oral stories I mentioned, they would often change or redirect the story to a different ending or a different path. It's like choose your own adventure type books. They did that based on the needs of their tribe or the person listening to the story. So I think this is why, oftentimes we see contextual variations from generation to generation over thousands of years. Writing probably slowed down the changing of these stories because they did have it written down, but it didn't stop the changing of the stories based on the cultural needs. And I think that that's what we're seeing in the contextual variation. It's not just mishaps, because we know it's not just mishaps. There's differences contextually in these different variations. And I think that's what we're seeing. That's my own take. I have not seen that anywhere, but that's what I get from this. A great video for this that came into my inbox just the night before I thought I was going to film this was this video that I'm going to show you a couple clips of from here by Alex O'Connor at Cosmic Skeptic over on YouTube. And he's talking about refuting this gentleman that went on the Joe Rogan show talking about the Dead Sea Scroll, the Isaiah Dead Sea Scroll, specifically Isaiah 1QA, and how Wes, the gentleman Joe Rogan, said with 100% accuracy, this Dead Sea Scroll now gave us a document of Isaiah that was 1,000 years earlier than what we currently have, that has made the Bible as we know it today. And there's no variations. It's 100% the same. Now, that wasn't actually accurate. But as you know, or maybe as you don't know, Joe Rogan is is the biggest podcast in the world. And now we have this gentleman telling the world on this biggest podcast that this is a historical fact, and it's not. Can you see the issue with history when it's told like this? Now, if you're not familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were documents that were found in 1947 that were written somewhere around the turn of BCE to CE, so around the time that Jesus was alive. These documents were in part, and sometimes in almost the fullness, as in Isaiah 1QA, of the Old Testament, or what we would call the Old Testament. That would just be the Bible of that day. That would have been their scriptures of that day. The Qumran community that lived there that ended up burying these documents when they had to flee. This is what we suspect happened. And the reason I'm bringing this video up is if you care to go watch it, you will see Alex refute Wes, who was on the Joe Rogan show, saying there was no variations between this 1,000-year earlier document at the Dead Sea Scrolls and the document that was used to translate into our modern day Bible, the Christian Bible, and the Jewish Bible, the Masoretic text, which was made in the Middle Ages, that there was no variations, that they were 100% the same, because of course, many Christians and even probably Jewish people want to prove that God was the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But these documents don't do that. Alex in his video shows you that there was 2,600 plus variations, contextual variations, not just spelling, but contextual variations between the 1,000-year-older document and the document that has made our Bible today. That is a huge amount. 2,600 variations, contextual variations between the two that happened over a 1,000-year period. This proves my point in so many ways that history cannot be 100% reliable. Here's the other thing that I just have to point out. Alex does a great job in his video at the very end. He has another scholar come on and share with us that this is actually the variation that we're seeing is about, there was a lot of numbers that were thrown around in this video, but basically in ancient manuscripts, it on average between 92 to 95%, between transcribe and transcribe and transcribe over the centuries or over the millennia, that was the accuracy between the transcript, whatever that word is. But that means that somewhere between 5 to 8% got shifted or changed on average. Now, sometimes there was more, sometimes there was less, but Wes, because he's trying to prove that the Bible doesn't change, that's why he misquoted. And he did do a retraction video, but it really still left you questioning whether or not he believed that it was the same. Anyways, you can go watch it all because Alex does a great job with this. But it just basically goes to show that all ancient manuscripts have that percentage. Bible is not unique. And I point that out because we're going to be talking about the Bible more coming up in the next couple videos, especially as I get into my own testimony about how, there's my word. You can see I was probably an ex-evangelical because I use the word testimony, but as I talk about my exodus out of the Christian church, the Bible is important. The Bible is important because it's been used as a foundation for a lot of our Western culture. The stories have created our culture as if they were historically accurate. Again, I mentioned that earlier in this video, that up until about 1700, so 18th century, people believed that the Bible was historically accurate. And so that is an example of how powerful mythology and history blending and in bed with each other can be, because we've now constructed our world based on mythology, not based on actual history, and we're reaping the consequences of that. And that's why there's a channel called Deconstructing Patriarchy. I'm trying to bring all of this out so we can see it and understand how we're seeing the world is through this patriarchal lens that is not historically accurate, but it's mythology. To finish up this point, let's just watch this quick video from Dan McClellan as he says exactly what I've been trying to say in this video in much more succinct words.
If you just want them to be evidence that the Bible hasn't changed, you lose. Like, you can characterize them and you can squint at them and you can try to come up with fuzzy rhetoric. But if you are taking a hard critical look at the data, what it shows is that there is still quite a bit of textual fluidity, and we're seeing the developmental accretion of text to the Bible, and Isaiah 2, 9b through 10 is a perfect example of that. That is
Now, to finish this last murky point of how history is a mirage, we have to touch on something about the forgery that was happening in ancient text. because it was super common, especially in the Bible. So I had a lot more I was going to say about this, but basically, I'm going to put the link down below to Bart Ehrman's post that he writes on how many books he suspects were actually written by the authors that claim to be the authors. And he spells it out really clearly for you, like how many were anonymous, how many were homonymous, which means they sounded like a famous person, but they weren't. Their name sounded like a famous person. So the John that wrote Revelation, think of him as John that wrote the Gospel John, the beloved of Christ, but he wasn't. He just had a similar name. How many were forged or plagiarized, essentially, meaning that they were writing under Paul's name? This is a really great example, but actually were not Paul letters. And how many were actually written under the correct name? So his breakdown of this for the Bible, for the New Testament, is 6 to 9 were anonymous writers. We don't actually know. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not actually written by a Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that were the disciples. They were written decades later after Jesus had died, and they were not written by immediate disciples of Jesus. They know that much. There was one that was written by homonymous, I'm going to say that 5 times fast. That was the book of Revelation, John, I already mentioned. Forged writings were 10 to 13, and coming in at the lowest was the actual authors of the writings of the New Testament were 7 books. I just have to bring that point up because, again, if somebody's writing under a false name as if they were Paul, and then that gets taken into a historical accurate event, such as what we have seen the Bible as for most of its life, mythology that got taken as history is taught down through culture, because Bible used to be taught in university as a major one of the courses. It wasn't just the side thing that you took if you had curiosity or were going to become a pastor or a biblical scholar. It was one of your main courses. That's how integral the Bible has been in our history. And so you can start to see how much of this mythology of the Bible has gotten imprinted into our DNA as if it was factual history, to the point where we can't distinguish the two at this point in time. We just assume that that's all there was ever in our culture. And in this day and time where YouTube has been so prolific, we're starting to understand there was a lot of other gods and goddesses throughout all of time that are now, their stories are being resurrected. And we understand that they're stories and that they're not this 100% certainty that God is real and it's real in only this way and it's 100% factual and it's 100% historical. We understand that that's not what the case is, but we still have a lot of work to undo the 2,000 years of taking the Bible as history. This doesn't mean that history is useless. That's not what I'm saying. It might feel like that's what I'm saying. I think there's a time and a place for history, but we have to look at it through a critical lens and follow up with a really big question. So 1, we have to understand who's writing it. 2, what their motivation is. And 3, what is missing? Whose voices are missing from that history? Because that's probably the majority of what history actually was. What the missing voices. The biggest question, though, I'm going to leave you with today is this one. If history is this jumbled mess of murky waters that we can't really get our hands around, if it's this mosaic, then why are we putting so much weight into history and building our current lives based on this murky looking past? And we're also putting this idea on ancients that they knew something we didn't know, that they knew something about the divine and about the planet and about life that we didn't know in our modern age, when it's actually the reverse is true. Because of science and because of evolution, we know more about those things in this day and age. But we keep putting more weight as if these people were more intelligent and wiser and more spiritually attuned. They just didn't have the benefit of society, so they had to rely more on mythology and the mythological world. So there you have it. That's my big question that I'm going to leave you with. Have to remember these key points as we move forward into our next couple of videos. 1, most of history is not knowable. We haven't heard from most of the voices of the past, and therefore we don't really know what the full picture of the history looked like. Even the history we do have is not an accurate picture. It's very murky at best. Number 2, what we do know of history is often a collective memory bank that was using that idea of collective memory, where we adapted the facts of the past to meet the cultural and spiritual needs of the present. Number 3, I believe I already said this, but most of history is actually missing. We don't have the voices of all of the marginalized people, which was at least 50%, but most likely more, of the population that have lived on this planet. And number 4, most importantly, everything, unless you've done the work that I've talked about in this channel, it doesn't have to be in the specific way that I'm doing it, but unless you've done the work to peel off the patriarchal lens, most or all of history that we know of today is being taught and interpreted through a patriarchal lens. And that is the main point of this channel, is to help you understand that. So when you look back at history, when people tell you, oh, it was definitely this way, you have all of the facts that you've just gone through in this video with me and all the future videos that we're going to go through with mythology and understanding even more about these two fields, and be able to say, well, actually, have you thought about it through this lens? You don't have to say patriarchal, and you'll be able to show them a whole new world. And here's why I think this is so important, is as we've seen, history / mythology are in bed with each other. They've developed our current culture in a way that we think is historically accurate, but is much more likely to be mythologically accurate, if that's even a word. They're also driving us into the future unless we change those stories. I'm so excited for the next video because we're going to dive into mythology more and really understanding mythology. I've given you a little hint that mythology is often true stories, but not historically accurate. I'm going to give you a lot more quotes to understand what mythology is. Please join me in the next video. Make sure you've gone back and watched the other videos if you finished this one before. Right, there you have it. Episode 5 is done. We have talked about what is history and how we even get at making history, because it has to be made. It's not just like coming to us on a platter of options that we've already had concocted for us. We've talked about how oral tradition, myth, and history are all in bed with each other, and it's really hard to parse those out. We've also obviously talked about why it's so complicated to get at any 100% accuracy within history. So here is your challenge this week. I want you to take one myth that you know and rewrite it from a different angle, especially maybe more of that partnership, matriarchal, matrilineal perspective. The one I would suggest, maybe, just saying, is the creation story of Genesis. How would you write that if it had been a matrilineal partnership type society? If you need some help, definitely go back and watch my 1A through 1D videos to understand how we built the patriarchy, right? If you don't remember that. And then go check out Rain Eisler's work with her partnership societies. That would also really help you. But I think just get creative. What would you like to see if it wasn't a patriarchal story, but a matrilineal story? And then if you can, share that on TikTok and tag me. I'm really active over on TikTok. I'm going to put a call out over there as well, if I remember. Holli McCormick, I think it's Holli C. McCormick over there. Or you can share it here if you have your own YouTube channel and tag me. And let's start building this vault of new stories, rewriting the old stories, but making them better and more creative and more practical for this day and age. What do you think? All right. Ready, set, go. Bye-bye. Jumping on here one more time because I totally forgot that I did this assignment. Yes, I did this assignment with the Sacred Tryst. I used Genesis as my model of a creation story I was rewriting, and I rewrote it as genetrix, which means ancestress, I believe in Greek. I can't even remember what I did. But if you'd like access to that, then head over to my Substack. If you're already here, then that means you already have access to it. If not, then head over to Substack, hollimccormick.substack.com. A link is down below, and subscribe to any of the investor paid levels, and you'll be able to have access to the book I'm writing, as flipping on its head the idea of who the Christ is. It's actually going to be Mary Magdalene, and she's going to teach Jesus everything she needs to know. But it starts with introducing this new creation story. That will be released on March 26th of 2025. Not sure when you're watching this, might already be there. It's $5 a month, $50 a year, or if you want to be in the investor level, I think it's 111 in that investor level, 111. All right, so much love. Go enjoy and have some fun with this. Bye-bye.